It was meant to be a happy day. A family reunion, laughter, children playing, and music filling the backyard. I had spent the morning baking biscuits for my granddaughter, the light of my life. But when I arrived and saw her standing in the middle of the crowd, her head shaved clean, my smile froze. My daughter-in-law laughed loudly, saying it was just a joke. My son stood beside her, saying nothing. That was the moment something in me hardened. If you're watching this, please like the video, subscribe, and listen. Because this isn't about hair. It's about cruelty disguised as laughter. The air at that party was thick with chatter, laughter, and the smell of roasted food. Balloons floated in the garden, children ran in circles, and someone had just started a game of music on the speaker. I stood near the table arranging the gifts when I saw her, my 6-year-old granddaughter, standing quietly near the fence. Her little hands were clasped in front of her, her eyes cast down, and her head completely shaved. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The bright sunlight made her scalp glisten. Patches of redness marked her skin where the razor had scraped too close. Her pink dress, the one I'd bought her for her birthday, hung loose and wrinkled. Around her, a few children whispered and giggled. One boy pointed and laughed. My heart sank deeper with every sound. I thought maybe it was some medical issue, something no one had told me about. My chest tightened as I started walking toward her. But then I heard my daughter-in-law's voice, loud and cheerful, floating above the noise. She wanted to be brave. It's just a joke. We thought it would be funny. Laughter followed. Real, careless laughter. People clapped like it was part of a show. My son, standing beside his wife, smiled awkwardly and shrugged, as if saying, "What can I do?" The sight made something twist painfully inside me. My granddaughter glanced at her parents and tried to smile too. A fragile, trembling smile that didn't reach her eyes. The moment our eyes met, she blinked quickly, as though fighting tears. I walked closer, the noise fading in my ears, the smell of food and perfume, the sound of laughter. All of it turned sour. The music from the speaker, cheerful moments ago, now sounded like mockery. I wanted to ask why, but I already knew. It wasn't a joke. It was humiliation, dressed as humor. I knelt beside her, my knees pressing against the grass. Her tiny fingers trembled as I touched her cheek. She whispered so softly I almost missed it. "Mummy said I looked ugly before, so now I'm funny." I felt my stomach drop. That small sentence, innocent, broken, tore through every boundary I had built to keep peace in this family. She didn't understand the cruelty behind those words. She only understood that love had turned into laughter at her expense. Around me, conversations continued. Some relatives smiled nervously, pretending nothing was wrong. A few even chuckled, saying things like, "Oh, she'll forget it by tomorrow," or "Kids don't mind." But I saw what they didn't. The way she held her small hands behind her back to hide the trembling. The way her shoulders shook each time someone looked at her. I looked up at my daughter-in-law. She was still laughing, her arm linked with my son's. Her face was glowing, not with guilt, but with satisfaction. "It's just hair," she said, sipping her drink. "It'll grow back." My son didn't say a word. Not one. He didn't even look at me. He just stared at the floor, as though his silence could erase what had been done. It wasn't about hair. It was about dignity. About a child learning that cruelty could be accepted if it made people laugh. And about a mother who believed humiliation was a form of parenting. I stood up slowly, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the music. No one noticed. People went on dancing, eating, pretending. But I saw the truth. That kindness had left that place long ago. As I turned away, my granddaughter clung to the hem of my dress. Her grip was light but desperate, her eyes pleading without words. That was the moment I made my decision. I wouldn't raise my voice or cause a scene. I would protect her the only way I knew, by walking out of that place with her hand in mine. Everyone laughed, except me. That laughter would echo in my mind for weeks. It would follow me through sleepless nights, through silence, through the sound of a child crying softly into my shoulder on the drive home. But I didn't care. I had already chosen. They could laugh all they wanted. I wasn't staying another moment in a house where cruelty was entertainment. That day, in the middle of that party, surrounded by people who called themselves family, I understood something cruelly simple. Sometimes, the worst monsters are the ones who smile while they hurt you. And from that moment forward, I knew. Love could never be silent again. When I reached home that night, my mind was still trapped in the noise of that party. The laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the hollow cheer that had covered the cruelty I'd just witnessed. My granddaughter sat quietly beside me in the car, her small head leaning against the window. The porch light reflected off her bare scalp, making her look older than 6. That sight alone was enough to shatter something deep inside me. When we stepped inside, I could finally see the full damage. The skin on her scalp was raw and pink, with tiny red marks from a dull razor. Whoever had done it hadn't even cared to be gentle. Her dress smelled faintly of disinfectant, as though someone had tried to wash away guilt with cleaning liquid. I helped her sit down, poured a glass of warm milk, and tried to keep my hands from shaking. She looked at me, her lower lip trembling. I knelt beside her again, brushing a tear from her cheek. She whispered in that fragile, broken tone only a child can have, "Mummy said I looked ugly before, so now I'm funny." Those words hit me harder than any slap I'd ever received in my life. My throat tightened, but no sound came out. I felt every ounce of my age in that moment. Not because of weakness, but because I realized how many generations of women had been taught to stay quiet in moments like this. I wanted to march back to that house, to shout, to tear down every piece of that fake laughter they hid behind. But I didn't. I looked at the little girl in front of me and realized anger wouldn't fix this. Care would. I took her gently to the bathroom. The tiles were cold beneath our feet. I fetched a bowl of lukewarm water, soaked a soft cloth, and began wiping her scalp with slow, steady movements. She flinched once, twice, but didn't cry. She had already learned to cry silently. That broke me even more. Each time the cloth passed over her head, I whispered small reassurances. Not lies. Truths. That she was beautiful. That she was brave. That what was done to her wasn't love and never would be. After cleaning the wounds, I rubbed a small amount of soothing balm onto the reddened skin. She closed her eyes and leaned into my touch. That was when I realized. She wasn't just hurt physically. She was learning to live in a home where love was mixed with humiliation. And I couldn't let that continue. When she finished her milk, she looked up at me and asked softly, "Will Daddy be angry that I came with you?" I paused, my heart twisting. I wanted to protect her from the truth, but I couldn't lie. So I said what I believed. No one can be angry at someone for being safe. She nodded, unsure what that meant, and walked toward the bedroom. When she fell asleep, I stood in the doorway and watched her breathe. The blanket rose and fell gently, her small fingers clutching the corner like it was a lifeline. That was when I made my decision. I wasn't sending her back. For the first time in years, I felt my mind sharpening with clarity. I wasn't just a grandmother now. I was her only shield. Every instinct told me to protect her, even if the world called it overreaction. I went to my desk and took out a notebook, the same one I used for bills and reminders. I wrote down everything she had said. Every detail, every mark, every word her mother had used as a weapon. Not out of hatred, but for proof. Then I looked at her photographs. One with long hair flowing down her shoulders. Another with a paintbrush in her hand, smiling. The same child who had spilled paint on her mother's carpet. And paid for it with her dignity. As I watched her sleeping, I promised myself something quietly. I wouldn't let her grow up thinking cruelty was normal. I wouldn't let her carry that lesson into adulthood like so many women before her. That night, as the house went silent, I sat by her bed and held her hand. I didn't pray for revenge. I prayed for strength. Strength to act, to protect, and to end this pattern before it could scar another generation. Because in that moment, I realized something powerful. Motherhood doesn't end when your children grow up. It begins again when their children need saving. The next morning, I woke to a silence that felt heavier than the night before. The sunlight crept through the curtains, soft and warm, but nothing inside me could feel it. My granddaughter was still asleep in the next room, curled up like a small animal hiding from the world. I could hear her soft breathing, steady but cautious, as though she had learned not to make too much noise. I made tea, sat at the table, and waited. Waited for someone from my family to call, to ask, to care, but the phone never rang. By noon, I realized the silence wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. A shield built by guilt and pride. My son didn't call, neither did his wife, not even my other relatives who had been at the party. Not one message, not one question. The same people who had clapped and laughed now pretended the night never happened. The same people who had seen the cruelty with their own eyes now treated it like smoke. Something that vanished if you didn't talk about it. That silence was worse than anger. Anger, at least, means someone still feels. Silence means everyone decided to stop seeing the truth. I looked at the clock and thought about calling my son myself. My fingers hovered over the phone for a long time. But what would I say? Why did you let her do that? Why didn't you stop her? The words felt too fragile for the reality I had seen. So, I put the phone down and turned instead toward the child who had no one else. When she woke up, she looked around the room with confusion, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to be comfortable. "Can I stay here?" she asked softly. I smiled and said yes. She nodded once, without joy, just relief. That small, careful gesture broke my heart all over again. For the rest of the day, I watched her play in the living room. She drew with crayons, though she avoided mirrors. Each time she passed a reflective surface, she turned her face away quickly. That was when I realized that what her mother had done wasn't just about control. It was about shame. She had wanted to break the child's confidence, to make her small, quiet, compliant. And everyone else had watched it happen. In the afternoon, I got a call from a distant cousin. Her voice was cautious, polite, as if she were afraid to take sides. She said, "Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe she didn't mean it that way." I thanked her and hung up. That sentence, "she didn't mean it that way," had been used my whole life to excuse cruelty. It was used when my own husband raised his voice, when my son ignored me, when people hurt and smiled after. I was done excusing it. That night, I sat with my granddaughter at dinner. She ate quietly, pushing her food around the plate. I noticed the way she waited for my permission before taking each bite, like she was afraid of making a mistake. I told her gently, "You don't need to ask here. This is your home." She looked up, eyes wide, as if no one had told her that before. I tucked her in early and stood by her door long after she fell asleep. I could feel the weight of silence pressing on the house, on my chest, on everything. My family wasn't speaking, not because they didn't know what happened, but because they didn't want to face what it said about them. And in that silence, I understood something about families. Some stay quiet, not to keep peace, but to keep their comfort. They'd rather protect the illusion of harmony than the people who are actually hurt. I wasn't going to be part of that anymore. I walked to the window, looked out at the empty street, and promised myself that I wouldn't wait for anyone's permission to act. I had spent years believing that peace came from patience, but peace without justice is just another kind of prison. That night, I gathered my courage like armor. I didn't know exactly what I would do yet, but I knew this. I would not let silence bury her story the way it had buried mine so many times before. Sometimes, it's not the cruelty itself that destroys a person. It's the way everyone else pretends not to see it. And that night, I decided I'd never pretend again. The morning after the silence, I woke with a feeling I hadn't felt in years. Finality. The kind that doesn't come with rage or shouting, but with a quiet, steady pulse. It was the same calm a storm leaves behind, when everything is clear and nothing can return to how it was before. I had spent a lifetime trying to keep families together, smoothing every sharp edge, ignoring every insult for the sake of peace. But when I saw my granddaughter's bare scalp in that party's cruel light, I realized peace without protection is just surrender. The decision had been forming long before that night. In every ignored phone call, every cold visit, every moment I swallowed my pride to keep my son close. The party only revealed what had already rotted beneath the surface, a family that laughed louder than they loved. I replayed the scene again in my mind. The music, the clinking glasses, the careless jokes. My granddaughter standing small and still, her mother's cruel laughter echoing louder than any applause. I remembered how everyone had turned away, pretending not to notice. That was the moment I knew. If they could mock a child like that, they would never protect her. I packed a small overnight bag, not for me, but for her. A change of clothes, her favorite blanket, the stuffed rabbit she used to sleep with when she stayed at my house. I moved quietly, not out of fear, but out of resolve. By the time the afternoon sun began to fade, I was back at that house. The same laughter still spilled out through the windows. The same music played. My hand trembled only once when I rang the bell. My son opened the door, surprised, and before he could say anything, I walked past him straight to where she sat on the couch. My granddaughter's eyes widened, hopeful, confused. I reached out my hand to her and said simply, "Come, love, we're leaving now." The whole room went silent. The guests turned. The daughter-in-law laughed again, that sharp, mocking laugh. "Oh, she's overreacting. It was just a joke." Her friends joined in, weak chuckles filling the air. I looked around the room, at faces pretending comfort and saw not a single person brave enough to speak truth. I didn't answer her. I didn't explain. I didn't know anyone words. I just held the little girl's hand tighter and began walking toward the door. My son followed, voice shaking, saying something about talking later. But there was no later left. My heart had already closed that door. When we stepped outside, the evening air was cool against our faces. She looked up at me, unsure, still waiting for someone to stop us. No one did. No one dared. The door closed behind us with a sound that felt like an ending. Not of peace, but of illusion. We walked to the car slowly. Her hand was so small in mine, but her grip was strong. Desperate, almost instinctive. She didn't ask questions. She just looked ahead, silent but safe. When we got inside, I turned on the ignition and stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror. My face looked older, lined not just by age but by every moment I had stayed silent for others' comfort. Not anymore. As the car rolled forward, the music from the party faded, replaced by the soft hum of the engine. I could see the lights of their house shrinking behind us, bright but cold, like a theater that had just finished its final act. On the road home, the sky was a deep orange, the sun sinking slowly as if bowing out. My granddaughter rested her head on my lap, finally closing her eyes. I brushed my fingers gently over her scalp, promising silently that no one would ever hurt her like that again. By the time we reached home, the decision had already rooted itself deep within me. I would not wait for apologies or explanations. I would not play the role of the quiet elder who forgives and forgets. I would act. That night, as she slept peacefully for the first time in days, I sat by the window, staring out into the stillness. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel guilt. I only felt purpose. If they called love overreacting, then yes, I would overreact. I would protect her, even if it meant standing alone, because that night I finally understood. Sometimes walking away isn't weakness. It's the loudest form of strength there is. The drive home was long and quiet, but not the peaceful kind of quiet. The kind that fills a car when both hearts inside are learning what pain really means. The road stretched ahead like a dark ribbon, empty, except for us. I could hear the faint hum of the tires on the asphalt, the soft rhythm of her breathing, and the occasional hiccup as she tried to stop crying. She was only 6 years old, but her silence carried the weight of someone much older, someone who had already learned that love could hurt. The streetlights flickered by, casting silver streaks across her face. Every few minutes, I glanced down at her from the driver's seat. Her small fingers clutched the edge of her seatbelt like it was the only thing keeping her safe. I wanted to reach out and hold her, to tell her that it was all over. But I couldn't lie. It wasn't over yet. The worst kind of hurt is the one that doesn't leave bruises you can show. We drove through the quiet town, past closed shops and sleeping houses. Everything looked calm on the outside, but inside the car, I could feel her heart beating fast, the way children breathe when they're trying not to sob. When we stopped at a red light, she finally whispered, barely audible, "Grandma, was I bad?" Those 4 words hit harder than anything else that night. I pulled over slowly, put the car in park, and turned to face her. Her eyes glistened under the streetlight, wide and unsure. I wanted to say 1,000 things, to tell her she was precious, that none of this was her fault, that no one should ever call punishment love. But all I managed was to reach over, take her hand, and say softly, You were perfect. They were wrong. That was all it took. She broke. The sobs came suddenly, deep and shaking. She buried her face in her knees, and her tiny shoulders trembled. I didn't try to hush her this time. I just let her cry. Because for once, she was safe enough to do it. The sound of her crying filled the car, filling every space that had been silent for too long. After a while, her tears slowed, replaced by hiccups and quiet breaths. Between them, she whispered something that made my blood run cold. Mummy said I had to learn to behave because I spilled paint on the carpet. Her voice cracked at the last word, as if she were confessing a sin. Paint. Carpet. That was all it took to humiliate a child, to strip her of dignity, to turn her into a lesson instead of a person. I felt something burn deep in my chest, not just anger but clarity. It wasn't a joke. It was punishment. And the people who should have stopped it, the ones who had laughed and called it harmless, were just as guilty. We drove the rest of the way in silence. By the time we reached home, her eyelids were heavy. I carried her inside, her arms loosely around my neck, and laid her on the couch. The house smelled of lavender and old wood. Safety, warmth, everything she had been denied. I covered her with a soft blanket and stood there for a long time, just watching her sleep. As the minutes passed, my thoughts sharpened into purpose. I couldn't let this go. Not this time. Not when a child was learning to fear laughter. I sat down at my desk, pulled out an old envelope, and began to write. Not to my son. He had chosen silence. I wrote to someone else, someone who had seen what people like my daughter-in-law tried to hide. My old colleague from Child Services. It had been years since we spoke, but I knew she'd remember me. I wrote down everything: the party, the laughter, the marks, the words my granddaughter had repeated. Every detail. Then I took my phone, turned on the lamp, and took photographs. The redness on her scalp, the faint cuts, the pillow where a few strands of shaved hair still clung to her collar. I stored them neatly in a folder, not as revenge, as protection. When I finished, I leaned back in my chair. The clock ticked softly. My heart was still racing, but for the first time that night, I wasn't scared. I was ready. I looked over at her sleeping form again, her small body curled under the blanket, her face peaceful, but swollen from tears. I promised myself right then I would never send her back to that house, not until I was sure she'd never be hurt again. And as I turned off the light, one thought echoed in my mind. Sometimes the road to safety isn't paved with forgiveness. It's paved with proof. That night after she fell asleep, I sat in the kitchen with the dim light above me, humming quietly. The house was silent, but my thoughts weren't. Every breath I took felt deliberate, controlled. I wasn't angry anymore. I was focused. Rage burns too quickly. Planning endures. I had spent my whole life waiting for others to fix things, waiting for apologies that never came. Not this time. I wasn't going to shout or beg or explain. I was going to build something stronger than noise. Evidence. I opened the drawer where I kept old documents. Medical papers, receipts, photos, my pension book. The small, boring pieces of a life that no one but me thought mattered. I pulled out a clean folder and began organizing everything I had gathered since the night of the party. Photos of her red scalp. The small patches where the hair hadn't grown back evenly. Notes I had written about what the little one said in the car. The more I placed inside that folder, the lighter I felt. It wasn't vengeance. It was protection. When you have nothing left but truth, you learn to handle it like glass. Carefully, but with both hands. The next morning, I brewed tea and waited for the sun to rise. My hands trembled slightly as I made the call to my old colleague from Child Services. Her voice sounded older but steady, the kind that could still command a room. She listened as I explained, not interrupting once. When I told her what the child had said, she was silent for a few seconds, then said firmly, "You did the right thing bringing her with you." Those words, "You did the right thing," felt like air after drowning. She promised to send a social worker for an informal welfare check that morning. Nothing dramatic yet, just observation, documentation, and follow-up. She told me to prepare any proof I had and to stay calm, because truth works best when it's quiet. After the call, I sat beside my granddaughter, who was still asleep on the sofa, curled up in the blanket. The sunlight touched her cheek. She looked peaceful, unguarded, the way children should always look. I brushed a strand of soft hair growing back and whispered, "No one will hurt you again." Then I got to work. I wrote a simple timeline, dates, events, people present. Everything from the party to that morning. I made copies of the photos and stored them in a second folder. I knew what came next would upset the family, but I didn't care about appearances anymore. I cared about what was right. By the time the social worker arrived, the table was neatly laid out. She was a young woman with kind eyes, but the kind of firmness you can't fake. She asked questions gently, noted everything down, and took the photos. When she saw the child's scalp, her expression didn't change, but her pen moved faster. She asked softly, "Would you be willing to provide a written statement?" I nodded, without hesitation. While she wrote her notes, I made her tea. My hands no longer shook. For the first time in years, I felt capable, not as a victim or a grandmother begging to be heard, but as someone taking action with purpose. After she left, I watched my granddaughter playing by the window, humming quietly as she colored. The house felt brighter, lighter. There was no laughter from others, no cruel voices, no mockery, just safety. The sound of crayons scratching paper, and the occasional giggle when she drew something silly. I knew the next steps would bring confrontation. My son would be furious. My daughter-in-law would call me dramatic, controlling, unstable. They would try to twist this story into something about pride instead of protection. But I was ready for that. I had lived through years of manipulation in smaller doses. Now I knew how to fight it, not with shouting, but with truth written in ink. That afternoon, I placed both folders inside my handbag and sat quietly by the window. The world outside looked ordinary. Neighbors mowing lawns, children riding bicycles, someone walking their dog. Life went on as if nothing had changed. But inside this small house, everything had shifted forever. I realized something then. Calm is not weakness. It's the weapon people underestimate the most. When you stop reacting and start recording, those who live on lies begin to fear you. And so, with my tea turning cold beside me, I made one more promise. I wouldn't stop until justice had a face. The world may not have clapped when I stood up that night, but I would make sure it noticed when I refused to sit back down. The next morning arrived with a strange calm, the kind that comes before something big shifts in your life. I woke early, made breakfast quietly, and packed a small lunchbox for my granddaughter. She was still asleep, her face soft, peaceful. I brushed her hair gently and told her we'd have a little adventure that day. What she didn't know was that it would be the first day of her freedom. Around 10 o'clock, I heard a knock at the door. Not hurried, not harsh, just firm. When I opened it, two people stood there, a social worker and a police officer. Their presence didn't fill me with fear. It filled me with relief. This was the sound of action. Steady, official, undeniable. The officer introduced himself politely, showing identification. The social worker, the same woman from the previous day, nodded with quiet understanding. She asked to speak with me before they went to the house. I handed her the file. Every document, every photograph, every note I'd written. She flicked through them slowly, expression unreadable, and said, "This is more than enough." As we drove toward my son's house, my heart beat in a rhythm I couldn't calm, not from panic, from determination. The streets passed in a blur of winter light. Houses lined neatly, fences trimmed, families walking dogs. The same kind of normal that hides so much cruelty behind closed doors. I sat in the back of the car holding my granddaughter's hand. She looked out the window, unaware of what was about to unfold. I whispered to her, "You're safe now, sweetheart. Completely safe." When we arrived, the door was half open. My daughter-in-law appeared in the hallway, her expression turning from confusion to disbelief. Her laughter, that cruel, piercing sound, had vanished. The officer stepped forward, calm but firm. He asked to speak with her and my son privately. I stayed outside with the social worker, standing near the garden fence, my granddaughter beside me. I could hear the muffled sound of voices inside, at first defensive, then desperate. The officer's tone remained level, steady, authoritative. The daughter-in-laws grew shrill, full of excuses. It was just discipline, not harm. We were joking. It wasn't serious. The kind of excuses that people use when they realize laughter has become evidence. The officer emerged after some time, followed by my son. His face was pale, eyes hollow, like someone who'd finally seen himself clearly for the first time. He looked at me but couldn't hold my gaze. His lips moved, forming my name, but no sound came out. Behind him, the daughter-in-law's voice trembled as she asked the officer what this meant. "Are you taking her away?" The social worker stepped forward and explained in measured words that the investigation was underway, that my granddaughter's well-being came first, and that temporary custody was being granted to me. Every word landed like a small gavel hitting the table of justice. My son stood frozen. My daughter-in-law's expression twisted into disbelief. She tried to laugh again, that hollow, brittle sound, but it broke halfway through. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. My silence was louder than anything I could have said. The officer handed me a copy of the interim order. It felt heavier than any document I'd ever held, not because of paper or ink, but because it represented something bigger. The proof that decency had finally stepped into a house that had forgotten it. As I guided my granddaughter toward the car, she held her small stuffed rabbit tightly against her chest. Her mother called after her, her voice sharp, desperate, suddenly full of affection that had never existed before. The child didn't turn around. She just held my hand tighter. When the car door closed, I took a deep breath. Through the window, I saw my son watching from the porch, shoulders slumped, face blank. For a fleeting second, I remembered the boy he once was. Kind, gentle, proud to protect his mother. That boy was gone, buried somewhere under fear and pride. I hoped that maybe, one day, what happened today would wake him up. The drive home was quiet again, but this time, the silence felt clean, like air after a storm. My granddaughter hummed softly, the tune barely recognizable, but full of innocence. The world outside moved on, cars, trees, clouds, while our world, small and broken, began to rebuild itself. When we reached home, the officer helped carry in a few things, thanked me for my cooperation, and told me to expect a follow-up call. The social worker smiled, said, "You did exactly what needed to be done." I nodded, unable to speak. Sometimes words aren't strong enough for relief. That night, as I tucked my granddaughter into bed, she asked quietly, "Will they laugh again?" I kissed her forehead and said, "No, darling, not anymore." Because for the first time, the law had replaced laughter, and truth had found its way home. The days that followed moved slowly, each one stitched with quiet relief and small routines that began to heal us both. The chaos had ended, but the echoes remained. Paperwork, court dates, evaluations, and the long process of proving what was already obvious. Every morning, my granddaughter woke up in my home, safe and unafraid. She had her breakfast at the table by the window, sunlight falling across her little hands as she spread jam on her toast. Her laughter, once cautious and shy, began to return in small bursts, the sound of life rebuilding itself. The court hearings began 2 weeks later. They were not loud or dramatic, just deliberate, calm, legal, final. The Child Services reports had been thorough. Photos, interviews, the testimony of the social worker, all consistent, all undeniable. My son sat across the courtroom, head bowed, face pale. His wife beside him, rigid, eyes darting between the judge and the floor. For the first time, there was no smirk, no laughter, no excuses. The truth had stripped them bare. When the ruling came, it was simple and firm. Temporary, custody granted to me, supervised visitation rights to my son, mandatory counseling sessions for both parents, and restricted contact for the daughter-in-law. I didn't celebrate. I just closed my eyes and breathed. The kind of deep, steady breath that feels like you're reclaiming your own lungs after years of holding your breath. The judge looked at me as he finished speaking and said, "Mrs. Thompson, you've done what many don't have the courage to do." I nodded, not out of pride, but out of understanding. Courage isn't loud. It's the ability to act when your heart is breaking. Outside the courthouse, the air was crisp. My granddaughter held my hand tightly, her small fingers warm in mine. We didn't talk much. She looked up at me once and said, "Grandma, are we going home now?" I smiled and said, "Yes, sweetheart, we're going home." And for the first time, home meant safety. The news spread quietly through the family. Some whispered sympathy, others avoided me, afraid to take sides. But I didn't need approval. I wasn't looking for support. I was looking for peace. My son called once, his voice trembling through the receiver. He tried to apologize, saying he didn't know how bad things had become. I let him speak. I didn't argue or accuse. I just said softly, "You did know. You just chose not to see." Then I ended the call. Love doesn't die overnight, but it does learn to protect itself. In the weeks that followed, our home found rhythm again. We planted new flowers in the garden together. She picked daisies, saying they looked happy. Every day after school, she'd run to the backyard, hair growing in soft curls again, laughing as she chased the neighbor's cat. The sound filled the house, a sound I had thought I'd never hear again. The social worker visited once a week, always leaving with a smile and a note that said, "Progress excellent." My granddaughter began art therapy. The first drawings she made were gray, full of heavy lines, but as the weeks passed, color returned. Blues, pinks, yellows, even orange suns and red flowers. Each new picture felt like a confession, not of pain, but of recovery. I kept a journal through it all, not for revenge or record, but as a reminder that justice is not something you wait for. It's something you build, one small act at a time. Every time I looked at the court order, signed and sealed, I didn't see punishment. I saw proof that silence had finally lost. Months later, my son came to visit. Alone. His eyes were tired, his face thinner. He sat on the porch for a long time before speaking. He said he was attending therapy, that he understood now what his silence had done. I listened quietly, watching the evening light fall across his face, the same light I once watched fall across his crib decades ago. He asked if he could see her. I agreed, under supervision, just as the court allowed. She greeted him politely, hugged him once, and went back to her coloring book. It wasn't rejection. It was boundaries. Even a 6-year-old can learn them when love has been tested. When he left, I didn't cry. I just felt calm. Life had found its balance again. That night, as I watched my granddaughter sleeping, I realized something profound. Justice doesn't always roar in courtrooms. Sometimes it whispers in the quiet breathing of a child who finally sleeps without fear. I looked at her small hands, curled gently against the pillow, and thought to myself, this is what winning looks like. Because justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't feel like victory. It feels like peace. The months that followed unfolded slowly, like a gentle sunrise after a long storm. Life didn't rush anymore. It settled. My granddaughter and I built our new rhythm. Quiet mornings with oatmeal and cartoons, afternoons in the garden, evenings filled with laughter that didn't echo with fear. Healing didn't come in grand moments. It came in the small, ordinary ones. The way she giggled when flour covered her nose while baking. The way she ran barefoot through the grass, her soft hair bouncing again as it grew back thicker than before. The first real change came when she started to sing. One afternoon, while painting by the window, she began humming. Soft at first, then louder, filling the house with a melody that didn't belong to pain anymore. I stood in the doorway, tears welling up. That small sound told me everything words couldn't. She was learning joy again. Every evening, after homework, we'd sit together with our tea and cocoa. I'd tell her stories from when I was young, about how I used to walk miles to school, about the first time I met her grandfather, about the small miracles of survival that make up a life. She listened wide-eyed, always smiling, sometimes interrupting with questions that made me laugh. She didn't know it, but those moments healed me too. Healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning to live without flinching at the past. And slowly, that's what we did. Once a month, we met with her counselor, a kind woman who specialized in children recovering from emotional neglect. The sessions were gentle, mostly play-based. My granddaughter would draw pictures of herself surrounded by hearts and flowers. One day she drew a picture of me, standing beside her under a big, bright sun. When the counselor asked her what it meant, she said, "That's Grandma. She's my sunshine now." I nearly broke down right there. For years, I had been her quiet witness, the person who saw, heard, and remembered everything when others didn't. Now, I had become her shelter, and that meant more than any apology ever could. The house felt different too. The walls that once carried echoes of loneliness now held laughter and warmth. The smell of biscuits baking, the hum of old radio songs, the clutter of toys on the floor. It was the sound of life being rewritten. Sometimes, when I looked at the framed photo of my late husband on the mantel, I whispered, "She's safe now." And I hoped he heard me. As spring came, I decided to enroll her in dance lessons. The first day, she clung to my leg, shy and hesitant. But by the third week, she was twirling in the front row, her small feet moving to the rhythm like she'd been born for it. When the recital came, she wore a yellow dress, ribbons in her hair, and she smiled through the whole performance. I clapped until my hands hurt. For once, the tears in my eyes were of pride, not sorrow. My son kept his distance, though occasionally he sent messages, polite, remorseful, unsure. He was attending counseling as required, and from what I'd heard, beginning to face his own guilt. I didn't answer his messages at first, but one evening, after watching my granddaughter dance in the living room, I replied with just 4 words. "She's happy. Thank you. I don't know if we'll ever go back to what we once were. But I do know this. Redemption begins with responsibility, and that's his to earn, not mine to give." The daughter-in-law never reached out, and that silence suited me fine. The world doesn't need every wound to end in reunion. Some just need closure. By summer, our life had found peace. We'd spend afternoons at the park, feeding ducks, eating ice cream, laughing without fear of being scolded for joy. On quiet evenings, she'd fall asleep on my lap, her small hand resting over mine. I'd watch her breathe, steady and calm, and think, this is what safety sounds like. Healing had taken its time, but it had arrived quietly, faithfully, like the tide returning after a storm. And though no one threw us a celebration, no one wrote our names in a newspaper, I knew our story mattered. Because every time a child laughs again after cruelty, the world becomes a little kinder. It has been almost a year since that day, the day laughter stopped being cruel and became healing again. Time, they say, doesn't erase pain, but it softens its edges until you can hold it without bleeding. That's what happened to us. The memories of that cruel joke, the fear in my granddaughter's eyes, the silence that followed. They no longer control us. They exist, but only as reminders of how far we've come. I often sit by the same window where she once painted her first colorful picture after everything changed. The light falls softly on the frame, the same way it did on the day she drew me as the sun. Outside, life moves on. Cars pass. Neighbors walk their dogs. Children laugh as they chase each other down the street. It's ordinary, but for me, it feels extraordinary. Ordinary peace is the greatest luxury a wounded soul can earn. Sometimes I think back to that night at the family party. The music, the laughter, the smell of food, all tainted now by the memory of that one cruel act. And yet, I no longer feel the same ache I once did, because what they meant for humiliation became the moment I found my purpose again. I used to think retirement meant slowing down, fading quietly into the background. But that day proved something else. That purpose doesn't end with age, and protection doesn't weaken with wrinkles. The community began to notice, too. Some neighbors, who had once stayed silent, started stopping by. They'd bring flowers or ask, quietly, how my granddaughter was doing. A few even confessed they had seen small things, heard small cruelties, but didn't know how to help. I never blamed them. Most people are kind, but not brave. It takes something personal, something unbearable, to turn kindness into courage. I told them the truth. You don't need to fight every battle. Just don't pretend you don't see one. That became my quiet mission. To remind others that silence protects no one but the wrongdoer. my granddaughter grew stronger every day. Her counselor once said, "Children heal faster when they're believed." And that's what I did. I believed her. Every story she told, every fear she whispered, I believed. Because disbelief is the first betrayal a child ever feels. I wasn't going to let her experience that twice. Now, she runs through the house barefoot, her laughter echoing down the hall. The first time I heard that laughter without hesitation, I cried in the kitchen. Not from sadness, from relief. Relief that love, when it's patient, can rebuild even what cruelty has shattered. As for my son, he continues his journey toward redemption. Slowly, quietly. He writes letters now instead of messages. They arrive once a month, folded neatly, full of apologies that sound genuine this time. I read them all. Some I answer, some I don't. Forgiveness is a door that opens only when the heart is ready. I'm not there yet, but I can see it in the distance. Sometimes, my granddaughter asks if she'll ever live with her parents again. I tell her honestly, maybe one day, if they learn how to be gentle. She nods, satisfied, because she knows now that gentleness isn't weakness, it's strength. Every evening, before bedtime, we sit together and read. Her favorite story is always the same, the one about the old oak tree that lost all its leaves but stood tall through every storm. She always points to it and says, "That's you, Grandma." I smile, stroke her hair, and whisper, "Maybe it's us both." The truth is, I never wanted revenge. I wanted justice. And justice, when done right, doesn't roar. It restores. It gives a child her laughter back, and a woman her peace. As I sit here tonight, pen in hand, the lamp casting a soft glow across my desk, I think of everyone who might hear this story. Maybe it will reach someone who's too scared to speak. Maybe it will reach someone who keeps excusing cruelty because family is family. If it does, then let this be the message that stays with you. Love, without respect, is just control. And silence in the face of cruelty is still cruelty. They called it a joke. I called it what it was, a cry for help, hidden behind laughter. And when no one else listened, I did. So now I'll leave you with this, my final thought. If you ever see someone laugh while breaking a child's heart, don't laugh with them. Don't look away. Walk toward the pain, even if your voice shakes. Because the smallest act of courage can save an entire childhood. That's the lesson I learned too late. But she won't have to.